Today I'm sharing my best easy brownie recipe. These brownies are fudgy, chewy, they're a little bit crisp at the edges, they have that tissue thin crust on top. You're going to be obsessed with this recipe. You can make it in less than 30 minutes, no mixer required, in just one bowl. My name is Tessa and I'm from handletheheat.com, where I love to share sweet treats with a sprinkling of baking science. And before we get started with this recipe, be sure to hit that little bell icon near the subscribe button so you're notified each and every time I post a new baking video. Now we're starting in my bowl here, and I'm going to add unsalted butter, 10 tablespoons, and some chopped semi-sweet chocolate. Now you can also use semi-sweet chocolate chips if that's easier. You just want to be sure to use a high quality chocolate. Now I'm going to actually take this to the microwave and microwave it in 30-second bursts until it's melted and smooth. And you want to be sure to stir between every burst so you don't burn the chocolate. Okay, my butter and chocolate is all melted and smooth. Now you could also do this in a double boiler if you don't have a microwave. Now before this cools, I'm actually going to add 1 cup of granulated sugar. And I want to add that to the hot butter mixture because that will help the sugar to dissolve into the batter so that you don't have any grainy texture. And I'm going to whisk this mixture vigorously until it's super smooth, and that will help to create that tissue thin crust on top of our brownies. Okay, so I'm gonna let that cool before I add in my eggs. So the first time I made this recipe, I actually used 2 large eggs and I was really impressed with the results, but I wanted a little bit more of a chewy texture. So if you're like me and you like chewy brownies, you can do 2 large eggs plus 1 egg yolk. That's what I'm doing today, and that extra egg yolk has more protein and will add more chewy richness to these brownies. Next up, vanilla extract. Okay, so to guarantee that we get that tissue thin crust on top, you're going to whisk the eggs into the batter for a full minute until the batter is super smooth and it's actually really shiny. That will help to create kind of like a meringue effect that will allow that tissue thin crust on top to develop. Next up is our dry ingredients. I'm adding in all-purpose flour, and you don't need a lot for this recipe. Next up, cocoa powder. I'm using unsweetened regular cocoa powder. And I'm just using a small amount. I want that cocoa flavor, but I don't want to add so much that the brownies become more dry or cakey. And then lastly, some fine sea salt. You can also use fine table salt. So you might be wondering why we're not using baking soda or baking powder in this recipe. Well, I want these brownies to stay nice and fudgy and rich, and if I added leaveners, then they would become more cakey, and the amount of air that we incorporated through whisking will provide enough lift so that the brownies get nice and tall and are still rich and fudgy. So I'm just going to stir these together with a rubber spatula. And then the last ingredient is optional, but I'm going to add 1 cup of semi-sweet chocolate chips so that we get that gooey chocolate factor when the brownies are fresh and warm from the oven. And just stir those to combine. So my batter's all done. Before I spread it into my 8x8 inch baking pan, I want to give you a few quick tips about baking brownies that are surprisingly important. First of all, this recipe makes an 8x8 inch square size pan of brownies. You could totally double this recipe and bake it in a 9x13 inch pan. I'll leave more instructions for that down below. I've lined my pan with parchment paper. You could also use foil. That just helps to allow you to lift the brownies out once they're done baking to cut them into nice shapes and squares. When it comes to baking brownies, I like to use a light colored metal baking pan. This is aluminum. Now, the reason I like to do that is because it bakes the brownies nice and quickly. If you use a dark colored pan, then the brownies will get really dark at the edges and dry out at the edges, and we don't really want that. Now, if you use a ceramic or a glass baking pan, the brownies can take up to 50% longer to bake because those materials actually bake slower. So if you only have glass or ceramic and that's what you're using, you'll need to add some extra baking time until the brownies are all done. This is exactly the kind of thing that I address in full detail in my online baking class, The Magic of Baking. It's available 24/7 at your convenience. If you're interested, then go to handletheheat.com/magic to learn more. I'm going to just scrape my batter into my baking pan and then smooth out the top. And this will go in a 350-degree oven for about 30 minutes. You want to start checking about 5 minutes earlier than that You'll know your brownies are done when you insert a toothpick into the center and it comes out with a few moist crumbs still attached. When it comes to brownies, I always prefer to err on the side of under baking them because they will continue to bake as they cool in the hot pan. And you can always refrigerate brownies that are a little bit under baked and they become kind of like fudge, but you really can't save over baked dry brownies. So err on the side of under baking here. Okay, my brownies are out of the oven. It smells amazing. They have that beautiful tissue thin crust on top due to all of that whisking that we did. I cannot wait to let these cool. I'm gonna let them cool for about 30 minutes before I remove them from the pan and let them cool completely. You can of course serve your brownies warm. I like to do that with a glass of cold almond milk, but for really clean cuts, you wanna let the brownies cool completely and use a big knife to get those beautiful slices. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I really hope you love this recipe. If you give it a try, don't forget to send me a picture over on Instagram, and I can't wait to see all of your brownie creations. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe before you leave for new baking videos every single week, and I'll see you next time.